I have to admit being a bit surprised when I found out that Dr. William Lane Craig put a response to my Countering the Kalam series online in a podcast. I'm actually extremely gratified to see that I garnered enough attention that he felt it was worth his time to put a response to me, and for that I thank him. The thing is, given that he's put out other podcast responses to other YouTube personalities, and their counter-responses in kind were actually kind of instrumental in my own deconversion back in the day, I see this as a bit of a badge of honor, to be honest. I'm speaking here of YouTubers Theoretical Bullshit and Skydive Phil. Love you guys. Anyway, following their lead, I kind of feel the need to respond in kind to clear the air. I think Dr. Craig has left the door open to allow me to express some flaws in his arguments in the response, and to further critique the Kalam. It's also been a long time since I've been able to do a proper YouTube video due to my work and personal life just getting way more demanding in the past year since I started this online atheism thing. Who knew being a father was going to take up so much time? So, in case you haven't seen it, I'm going to put a link to Craig's podcast response in the description box. He also very kindly puts a transcription on his website that you can find in the link. I will be quoting the relevant parts as we go through my rebuttal, and I also hope that Craig, if he's listening, and anyone following the exchange, doesn't mind that I respond a bit out of the order that Craig uses to present his critiques of me. So with all that, let's begin. What I find interesting is how at the beginning of his podcast, Craig addresses my critique on absolute simultaneity, and he mentions that somewhere around 80% of what I wrote could be ignored, since he now says that absolute simultaneity isn't required for the Kalam. Now, first off, I presented the arguments against absolute simultaneity along with arguments against the A theory of time, since they're both two sides of the same coin. The two issues are intertwined very closely, and the same sorts of objections against absolute simultaneity will account against the A theory of time. So even if Craig had it out for absolute simultaneity not being required, objections against it still count against the A theory of time, which the Kalam does require. Now, secondly, Craig's appeal to cosmic time as a solution to not requiring absolute simultaneity for the Kalam does nothing more than push the problem back just one step. Now, to clarify things, cosmic time refers to the amount of time specified in the equations we use to gauge the expansion of the observable universe. Craig correctly states that this is the reference frame cosmologists use when they say the universe is 13.8 billion years old. The problem here is that this cosmic time is at best considered an approximation, since we know from inflationary cosmology that the expansion of the universe is not constant. The time value we get from the equations is pretty good in terms of describing the age of the current expansion of our universe, but it's not a preferred place or a preferred reference frame that we'll get into later. Further, it just kind of raises the questions that need to be addressed by what is meant by time, which puts us right back in the debate about which theory of time is correct. Next, we turn to the question of, is the Kalam circular? Craig contends that his context of using theological arguments to advocate for the A theory of time and the subsequent Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity to support it was a work for Christians. This would not be what he would do in apologetic contexts, where he would rest solely on non-theological, metaphysical arguments for such a position. Now, I've argued that despite being able to do this move, the methods of science would arrive at the opposite conclusion to what Craig's preferred metaphysical views are, and so that would trump any such metaphysical arguments Craig would put forward. Now, I also happen to believe that Craig's metaphysical arguments are actually pretty terrible, which I'll get into a bit later, but for now, my point is that grand metaphysical conclusions about the nature of time should be formed by scientific conclusions, not the other way around. Now, if you hold to that, then the Kalam would fall prey to the circular charge. If you do not, as Craig apparently doesn't, then the charge is evaded. This doesn't mean that avoiding the circular charge in this way is free from other unwanted consequences, and that's what I want to focus on next. So even if you feel that scientific conclusions shouldn't trump metaphysical intuitions, I want to press this very important point. Science says that Craig's Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity is false. With that, Craig's A theory of time is subsequently falsified, and without the A theory of time, the Kalam is unsound and fails as an argument for the existence of God. Now, perhaps I'm wrong, since this can be interpreted in a number of ways, but in his critique of my work, Craig seems to acknowledge this.
He's rejecting metaphysical arguments for your theory of time in favor of just science, what science tells us. And therefore, he ignores everything that I've written in defense of the A theory and against the B theory, because we oughtn't to let metaphysical, philosophical arguments get in the way of what science tells us about time.
Remember, my point here is simply that if we follow the methods of science, it tells us that Craig's A theory of time is false. Now, Craig is as free as he wishes to reject the conclusions of science and to rely purely on philosophical arguments for whatever conclusions he wants to establish. What he's not free to do, however, is to reject the conclusions of science in one context, but then appeal to them in another context when it's convenient. The best you could say about this is that it's cherry-picking, and we can see evidence of this here in his debate with Sean Carroll.
The evidence of contemporary cosmology actually renders God's existence considerably more probable than it would have been without it. I'm saying that contemporary cosmology provides significant evidence in support of premises in philosophical arguments for conclusions having theological significance. For example, the key premise in the ancient Kalam cosmological argument that the universe began to exist is a religiously neutral statement which can be found in virtually any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. It is obviously susceptible to scientific confirmation or disconfirmation on the basis of the evidence. So, to repeat, one is not employing the evidence of contemporary cosmology to prove the proposition that God exists, but to support theologically neutral premises in philosophical arguments for conclusions that have theistic significance.
So to paraphrase Craig, he's using the evidence of contemporary cosmology to support theologically neutral premises in philosophical arguments that have theistic significance. Now the problem for him is that if we're going to follow the evidence of contemporary cosmology, then the A theory of time is most likely false, and so his key premise in the Kalam argument is undermined. This brings me to my own argument. Premise 1. The evidence of contemporary cosmology renders the A theory of time most likely false. Premise 2. The evidence of contemporary cosmology is true. This is an assumption that Craig makes, and so do I. Premise 3. Therefore, the A theory of time is most likely false. Premise 4. The universe began to exist is true if and only if the A theory is true. Conclusion. Therefore, the universe began to exist is most likely false. Now, before getting to my meaty first premise, allow me to quickly explain why the fourth premise is true. Remember back to my very first entry in the Countering the Kalam series, where I go over the technical definitions that Craig uses. Now, when Craig says begins to exist, he explicitly means the following. An entity E comes into being at time t if and only if 1. E exists at t, 2. T is the first time in which E exists, and 3. There is no state of affairs in the actual world in which E exists timelessly, and finally 4. E's existing at t is a tensed fact. Now it's that fourth part that's the key here, since tensed facts only exist on the A theory of time. In fact, that entire part is there to explicitly draw out that the Kalam is predicated on the A theory of time. So according to the methods of science, the philosophical premise, the universe began to exist, is most likely false, even assuming that the universe had a quote-unquote beginning. This is because, in that case, the beginning is like the front edge of a ruler. The ruler is always there, even if there's a first inch marked on it. In short, basically time doesn't work in the way Craig needs it to in order for the argument to work as an argument for the existence of God. Now, it's very important to note that this does not mean that science proves a God does not exist. It simply shows that the impetus that Craig is using to try and argue for the existence of a God is false. Now at this point, critics might acknowledge my fourth premise, but take issue with the first. Does science really show that the A theory of time is most likely false? Now, just for reference, you could substitute the evidence of contemporary cosmology for science in the argument. It's going to work either way. This is because the evidence of contemporary cosmology is predicated on Einstein's relativity, which is the very theory that shows us that the A theory is most likely false. Now, since I intend this to be a bit of a science lesson, let me define my terms a bit. A privileged reference frame, in terms of relativity in physics, is basically a physical place where the laws of physics work differently. Back in Einstein's day, in the early 1900s, this was known as the ether. Today, you'd hear it called something like a place of absolute rest, or the absolute reference frame. What Craig and other A theorists would have you believe is that when it comes to relativity, and special relativity in particular, that it's simply a matter of taste when it comes to whether or not you use the orthodox Einstein interpretation, where there is no privileged reference frame, or the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, where there is an undetectable privileged reference frame. Now, the truth of the matter is that science is not silent on this, and for good reasons. Contrary to what Dr. Craig alleges, this is not simply because all of physics and all philosophers of science are holding to some outmoded form of logical positivism or verificationism. Now, Dr. Craig likes to make a lot of noise about the fact that the reason the Neo-Lorentzian view was discarded back in Einstein's time was for this exact reason. This is because back then Einstein and other scientists actually did hold to verificationism or positivism. Now, these two things have shown themselves to be untenable in modern times. I completely grant that. But the thing is, when criticism comes up, Craig invariably brings out this card and accuses his critics of unwittingly being a positivist, which is what he accuses me of. What he doesn't talk about so much is that why, in light of the failure of positivism, modern science still holds to the standard interpretation of relativity and still disregards the Neo-Lorentzian view that Craig needs in order for the Kalam to work. This is where science and philosophy of science come together to provide us with ways to decide between the sorts of interpretations on a set of empirical data that is at issue when it comes to relativity in this context. In modern science, it is not enough for a theory to simply be consistent with the data. We can come up with a myriad of theories to simply fit the data to get whatever conclusion we want, including that the moon is made out of green cheese. Now, before we get into why modern science rejects the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, let's do a very quick overview of what the evidence for relativity is, and contrast what the Neo-Lorentzian view entails compared to the standard interpretation of relativity. The evidence. I've spoken before about strong observational evidence we have for relativity, namely time dilation and length contraction. In short, the standard interpretation says that as we approach the speed of light, clocks of all types slow down uniformly and measuring rods contract in length. This sounds pretty crazy at first, but the issue is that we have tons of experimental evidence for this. Our modern GPS systems are based on this very principle. The difference between the two views discussed comes down to what it means for time to slow down or for measuring rods to contract. Now, here's the standard or Einsteinian interpretation. Einstein's relativity is based on two assumptions. First, that the speed of light in a vacuum is constant. And second, the laws of physics are the same in all reference frames, i.e., everywhere in the universe. That second assumption is the key point of contention. It is actually referred to as Lorentz invariance, or the principle of relativity, in the literature and in previous videos I've done on this topic. In technical terms, it means that for any experiment we conduct, the results will be the same regardless of how we are oriented in terms of rotation, translation between reference frames, or different points of view observing the experiment, or how fast we are moving. Now for the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, which eventually got itself down to two assumptions as well. First, there is an undetectable privileged reference frame with respect to which the speed of light in a vacuum is constant in all directions. 2. The rates of electromagnetic clocks moving with constant speed v relative to the privileged reference frame all vary with velocity v in the same manner. Now, I said eventually got down to two assumptions because the original Lorentzian approach to relativity was considered ad hoc since it first had to postulate that the ticking of electromagnetic clocks varied with velocity relative to the privileged frame. Then the theory became that, plus the assumption that mass varied with velocity relative to the privileged frame to account for the fact that gravitational clocks also slow down in exactly the same way. And finally, the same modification was made with the weak nuclear force, because we had experiments of meson decay, which showed them slowing down in exactly as predicted by Einstein's equations. Now, the thing is that in the 1950s, Herbert Ives was able to use the laws of conservation of energy along with these assumptions to derive an observationally equivalent set of equations to Einstein's. Now, for reference, the assumptions I'm quoting here are from S.J. Prokhovnik's. I'm sorry if I butchered the name, whoever you are. Those are from his derivation of the equations, since I have been unable to locate a copy of Ives's derivation. However, Craig claims in his published work that Ives was able to use only two assumptions along these lines, and I have no reason to doubt the truth of his claims. The first criteria we can use to decide between these two interpretations is accuracy. Clearly, science is justified in favoring a particular theory if that theory is more accurate than its competitors. Unfortunately, for the context of our debate, both interpretations are on equal footing. Now, thanks to the work of Herbert Ives, for any experiment we conduct, the observational results will be the same regardless of which interpretation we hold. The difference is that the Neo-Lorentzian view assumes that instead of the laws of physics being the same in all reference frame, there is a special privileged reference frame where physics behaves differently. In both interpretations, the equations describing what we actually observe work out exactly the same way, and those equations end up being Lorentz invariant for everywhere in the universe except for the supposed privileged reference frame assumed by the Neo-Lorentzian view. This privileged frame is undetectable because, most importantly, it is our changing velocity relative to the privileged frame that causes us to observe the phenomenon of time dilation and length contraction. The next criteria is leading to new advances in science. Now, this is a very problematic area for the Neo-Lorentzian view, since it is widely regarded that the key advance of Einstein's relativity was stipulating that the laws of nature must be fundamentally Lorentz invariant. Now, by assuming the laws of nature are Lorentz invariant, science was able to make tremendous advances in seemingly unrelated areas. First was the advance from special relativity to general relativity. And then, by specifying Lorentz invariance as a precondition, we were able to make huge advances in both quantum mechanics and quantum electrodynamics. Contrast this with the Neo-Lorentzian view, where the equations are not fundamentally Lorentz invariant. They are only Lorentz invariant in terms of parts of the universe that we can actually observe. On this view, it would not have given physicists the same kind of clues to specify Lorentz invariance as a precondition for all other fundamental physical theories, which led to the advances mentioned above. This is a major strike against the Neo-Lorentzian view. The only objection I can think of here is that if Craig was to assert that while the laws of physics were not fundamentally Lorentz invariant, it was somehow fundamental that they would always appear to be. But this would be an ad hoc modification of the Lorentzian view in order to avoid the problems I just laid out, and it would also make the next problem all the more acute for the theory. Now, the last criteria I want to go over is simplicity, and this is the nail in the coffin for the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, and I divide it into two parts. The first part is very simple. We do not have to be logical positivists or verificationists to hold that scientific theories which postulate extra entities which are unnecessary to explain all empirical data are more likely to be false than simpler alternatives. Now, the other component is conceptual simplicity. Now, proponents of the theory are quick to point out that thanks to the work of Herbert Ives, the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation was able to reduce down to the same number of assumptions as the Einstein interpretation. However, the measure of simplicity isn't only about the number of assumptions required, although that is admittedly part of it. A more important measure, however, is that of conceptual simplicity, which is where Einstein's interpretation is the clear winner. Consider the assumptions. On Einstein's view, We have a universe where the laws of physics are the same everywhere in the universe, and the speed of light in a vacuum is constant, or more specifically, no information can be transmitted faster than the speed of light. Now, when we move from theory to empirical investigation of the universe, this is exactly what we find to be the case. We would expect to observe the laws of nature to be Lorentz invariant if we assumed the laws of physics were the same everywhere. Contrast this with the Neo-Lorentzian view, where fundamentally the laws of nature are not the same everywhere in the universe, and that there is an absolute state of rest and progression of time. On this view, we would expect to find in experiments that the laws of nature are not Lorentz invariant. But we find the opposite. It's only by assuming that there is only one undetectable physical place in the universe where the laws of physics work differently than in every other place in the universe that the Neo-Lorentzian view is able to maintain compatibility with observations. Now that's a lot, so I kind of want to make an analogy to the patron saint of skepticism, Carl Sagan, and his story of the dragon in my garage from his book, The Demon-Haunted World. A fire-breathing dragon lives in my garage. Suppose I seriously make such an assertion to you. Surely you'd want to check it out, see for yourself. There have been innumerable stories of dragons over the centuries, but no real evidence. What an opportunity! Show me, you say, and I lead you to my garage. You look inside and see a ladder, empty paint cans, an old tricycle, but no dragon. Where is the dragon, you ask? Oh, she's right here, I reply, waving vaguely. I neglected to mention that she is an invisible dragon. You propose spreading flour on the floor of the garage to capture the dragon's footprints. Good idea, I say, but this dragon floats in the air. Then you'll use an infrared sensor to detect the invisible fire. Good idea, but the invisible fire is also heatless. You'll spray paint the dragon and make her visible. Good idea, but she's an incorporeal dragon, and the paint wouldn't stick, and so on. I counter every physical test you propose with a special explanation of why it won't work. Now, what's the difference between an invisible, incorporeal, floating dragon who spits heatless fire and no dragon at all? If there's no way to disprove my contention, no conceivable experiment that would count against it, what does it mean to say that my dragon exists? Your inability to invalidate my hypothesis is not at all the same thing as proving it true. Claims that cannot be tested, assertions that are immune to disproof, are veridically worthless, whatever value they may have in inspiring us or exciting our sense of wonder. What I'm asking you to do comes down to believing, in the absence of evidence, on my say-so. Now, when you look into the garage, you see exactly what you would expect as if there were no dragon. And so it is with our universe. We see exactly what we'd expect, assuming there is no place where the laws of physics work differently than anywhere else. What I want to point out next is that theism makes this already bad problem much worse. As a hypothetical, let's assume that theism is true and that God wants to leave breadcrumbs to lead people to his existence via natural theology. Presume if the Kalam was valid, God would be rather happy with apologists, and the argument would fit very well within modern scientific investigation into the nature of physical reality. But that's not what we see. What we see is that by all accounts, our space-time universe at least appears to be Lorentz invariant. This entire debate over the theory of time simply wouldn't exist if science actually revealed a world as scientists in Newton's time thought it was, one of absolute space and absolute time. Experiments would simply be Galilean invariant, and we would never observe time dilation or length contraction, or we would simply be able to observe the effects of the ether or preferred reference frame. Indeed, one must wonder why Craig's God would create a universe with absolute space and time, but do everything it can in order to make the space-time's true nature appear to be the exact opposite. Now, the philosophical criteria that we use to determine between two scientific theories clearly favors the Einsteinian approach to relativity over the Neo-Lorentzian approach. I want to stress that this is in the absence of logical positivism or verificationism. Without the Neo-Lorentzian approach, the A-theory of time the Kalam needs is shown to be scientifically untenable. Now, is this the final word from science on relativity? The approach that I've laid out from Science and Philosophy of Science gives us a way to allow for the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation to win out in principle over the standard interpretation. All we would need is a set of empirical data that could only be used to uniquely explain if there was an undetectable privileged reference frame. There is ample opportunity for this to occur in finding a solution to the quantum gravity problem facing physics today. If finding a solution to that problem entailed a violation of Lorentz invariance, then everything I've said would be overturned. Dark matter is a great example of something in contemporary science that we would say is currently undetectable, but we have good scientific reasons to think exists. Now, when it comes to relativity, science is currently investigating whether or not there are violations of Lorentz invariance in the laws of physics or in experiments, and so far we have found none. This provides no relief to Craig, since the provisional nature of science can just as easily invalidate any supposed evidence he appeals to in order to pretend that science points to the beginning of the material universe. Aside from relativity, in his debate with William Lane Craig, Sean Carroll gives us yet another scientific reason to consider that science undermines the idea that the universe began to exist. The piece of evidence is called the quantum eternity theorem, which states that if the total amount of energy in the universe is greater than zero, the universe must be eternal into the past and into the future. It also states that if the total amount of energy in the universe is actually zero, then time itself is not a fundamental part of reality, and so the Kalam argument would fail. Either way, the Kalam is in trouble. Craig never really responded to this point in the formal debate, but here's what he had to say on the second day of talks when pressed by Sean Carroll.
I would say that time is one of the most evident realities to us, inescapably real. The reality of time is even more evident than the reality of the external world, because I could be a brain in a vat with illusions of an external world around me, but the stream of contents of consciousness in succession, one after another, is undeniable and inescapable. Even the illusion of temporal passage is temporal passage. So that the reality of time, it seems to me, is one of the most basic, undeniable realities of metaphysics, of ontology that there can possibly be. And if time doesn't appear on the fundamental quantum level, then so much the worse for the ontology of that level. Then that simply means that it doesn't capture reality fully, to speak of reality on that sort of a scale.
Now I want you to notice this in the response. Craig doesn't deny the theorem. He simply says that in the only scenario where quantum mechanics allows for the universe to be finite, then so much the worse for science's ability to describe reality. He rejects the scientific conclusion that time is either eternal or not fundamental, depending on what the total energy of the universe actually is. Note that this does not entail that time is not necessarily fundamental. It simply means that time could not be as Craig needs it. Now, what is his possible justification for such a dramatic claim? He says that even if he was a brain in a vat, he would still be experiencing his consciousness as a stream of temporal events, and so then time must be fundamental. The problem with this is that, of course, for that to work, Craig must assume that mind is fundamental. His metaphysics allows for no method for consciousness itself to even possibly be emergent, and so likewise time could not possibly be emergent. This blatantly begs the question against naturalism, which would assert that whatever the ultimate nature of reality is, it is material. Contrast this with supernaturalism, which would assert that the fundamental nature of reality is the mental. Now, I believe the arguments above establish conclusively that when it comes to appeals to current science in respect to the Kalam, it tells us that the Kalam is more likely to be false than true. Proponents of the Kalam cannot have it both ways. They cannot point to general relativity and the standard Big Bang model to say that the universe had a beginning, but at the same time ignore what the methods of science tell us about the nature of time in light of relativity theory. What's more, I've shown elsewhere in my Countering the Kalam series that even pointing to the standard Big Bang model wouldn't necessarily establish that the universe began to exist. Now perhaps a proponent of the Kalam is willing to admit this much, but would then insist that metaphysical arguments can overturn the conclusion that we arrive at via purely scientific criteria. I've already touched on how this is problematic in one way with the quantum eternity theorem, but there are even bigger metaphysical problems for William Lane Craig. In his reply to me, William Lane Craig insists that metaphysical arguments can trump scientific conclusions. He specifically references what he calls the two strongest arguments for the A theory of time. They are, first, the indispensability of tense from human language and thought. Second, the incorrigible experience of the presentness of our own experiences. Now, his first argument is true as far as it goes. We can't actually dispense with tense from human language. However, this in itself doesn't do much for his case. This is because B theorists, such as Dwight Miller, have shown that although tense cannot be eliminated from our language, the truth conditions of tensed sentences need only tenseless facts, and this would block any need of an appeal to tensed features of reality. Now, as for his second argument, I find this to be particularly poor. Consider the incorrigible experience of our lack of motion while we're standing still. This doesn't detract from the fact that even while we are standing still, we are still moving at incredible speeds throughout space-time as the Earth moves around the Sun, let alone the motion of our galaxy throughout the universe. The list of incorrigible experiences that science has disabused us of is incredibly long. Just because we feel a subjective now does not mean that our consciousness, whatever it is, could not possibly be moving along some path in a four-dimensional space-time. However, I want to question the validity of our experience of the present moment on philosophical and scientific grounds. What does it mean to say that we experience the present moment if any notion of an absolute present is in an undetectable privileged reference frame? Further, how long does the present moment actually last? We very quickly run into problems trying to define that. In fact, the only principled answer that I can think of would be a Planck second, which is 1 × 10⁻43 seconds. But this is well beyond the range of what we meaningfully experience in terms of the passage of time. In fact, science tells us that we each live about 60 to 80 milliseconds in the past. Moreover, we will identify events that occur within that time frame as happening simultaneously. We can't even finish saying the word now before it is no longer technically that time. So references to now are to an unspecified length of time relative to when that word was said or thought. Now let me be clear. One need not necessarily embrace the B theory if you reject the A theory of time. All that we require is that the A theory of time to be false in order for the Kalam to fail. Now, like most of the perennial questions in metaphysics, the question of time has boiled down to two competing intuitions. None of the varied theories on time are incoherent, and based on these responses to the strongest metaphysical arguments for the A theory of time, I believe it is far from clear that we should prefer the A theory from a metaphysical perspective. This is borne out in our examination of views on the theory of time across disciplines. Now, when it comes to physics, one physicist has told me that they know of no working physicist who holds to Craig's Neo-Lorentzian interpretation. Even Craig admits in his published work that the vast majority of scientists do not adhere to the A theory of time. But what about philosophers? One of the most comprehensive surveys of philosophers was the 2009 PhilPaper survey. Here's what they found on the philosophy of time. Time, A theory or B theory? The other response received 58.2% of the vote. Accept or lean towards the B theory was 26.3%, and accept or lean towards the A theory was 15.5%. As you can see, the A theorists are in the clear minority. Admittedly, the B theorists don't fare much better, since the clear majority accepts another stance on the theory of time. However, this is still very problematic for Craig and the Kalam, since unless you accept the A theory and the absolute present moment, the Kalam fails. For the record, I'm not explicitly arguing for the B theory per se. However, it does fit our current scientific picture better than any other view at the moment. Now remember, this survey is among professional philosophers, specifically Western philosophers. However, we can glean more information from the survey by looking at the philosophers in more detail, sorting by area of specialty. Now, philosophers of science, we see the B theory pull ahead significantly, and the A theory falls a bit. Acceptance of the B theory comes in first at 49.2%, other theories trail it at 39.3%, and acceptance of the A theory is down to 11.5%. Now, interestingly, the inverse happens when we sort by philosophers of religion, a field that other studies have shown to be overwhelmingly populated by Christians. Here we see the A theory in the clear majority, 40.4%, other, again, 38.3%, and leaning towards the B theory would be 21.3%. Now, I think this says quite a bit, especially considering in his response to me, Craig says that his position on the theory of time is independent of his theological positions. Personally, I find that when reading arguments for the A theory, I almost usually find it to be theists defending the position, with very few exceptions. Now let's look at one last area, philosophers who specialize in metaphysics. Here, the B theory again comes out on top at 41.9%, other trails in second at 34.2%, and the A theory is in last at 23.9%. Now this last one is particularly interesting, given that Craig's defense of placing metaphysical assumptions over what science tells us to be true about reality. Even amongst metaphysicians, the B theory wins out. Now let me be clear. Absolutely none of this shows that the B theory is true, or even that the A theory is false. Now what it does show is that at best, the case on the philosophy of time is very far from settled, and the situation isn't as clear-cut as Craig implies in the podcast. The lack of physicists who hold to the A theory also would explain why so very many of them are atheists, and why there is no talk of God at conferences on contemporary cosmology. What I intend to do next is to show that the metaphysical problems with the A theory of time has when it comes to actually applying them to the Kalam argument. The Kalam is an argument that states that time itself must have had a beginning. But what exactly is time when we are discussing these different interpretations of fundamental physics? Well, in the standard interpretation, which is the predominant view in physics today, time is simply what clocks measure. So when physicists say time slows down as we approach the speed of light, they just mean that all clocks in that frame of reference slow down. Now, what about the Neo-Lorentzian view? It agrees with the standard interpretation that as we approach the speed of light, all observable clocks in their respective reference frames slow down. However, that's not what time is on this view. On the Neo-Lorentzian view, time is what a clock measures in the undetectable reference frame where the laws of physics work differently than everywhere else in the universe. Notice how the two theories agree on what happens to observable clocks. The only difference is that the Neo-Lorentzian view simply assumes that there is an undetectable, privileged reference frame, and that time is what it would be what we measure there if we could actually measure a clock there. Now this causes a few problems for Dr. Craig. First, notice how any notion of time is completely removed from anything we can observe, but is still a very physical entity. This reference frame is a physical place where, on the Neo-Lorentzian view, velocity relative to it has dramatic effects on the material universe that we do observe. In what way can it be said that we experience the flow of time in a physical reference frame that we have no access to? I've covered this already in responding to Craig's strongest argument for the experience of time, so I won't spend any more effort on it here. The bigger problem comes down to what happens when Craig assumes that the physical form of time has a beginning in the Kalam. Consider for a moment that Craig is right and the A theory of time is true, and the physical quantity of time described above has a beginning in the finite past. How exactly do we get that from an eternal God? Craig's response here is that God is supposed to be timeless before creating time. But this would mean that God is changeless before creating physical time. And as such, how could we have a period of eternity before the universe is created? Well, Craig's answer is that God willed from eternity to create the universe, which is a pretty strange answer. On closer inspection, if God eternally wills to create time, then how is it possible that the universe is not as old as God? The only way to avoid this problem is to reintroduce the concept of time through the back door, what Craig actually calls metaphysical time. Can you guess what metaphysical time is supposed to be? If you were going to go with the Sunday school answer of Jesus, you're not that far off. To Craig, metaphysical time is defined by God's sequence of mental events. He even uses the example of God counting down from eternity until 3, 2, 1, let there be light. This seems to reintroduce the entire problem the Kalam was supposed to solve all over again. Does metaphysical time have to have a beginning? Does God have a first thought? In fact, if God was counting down from eternity until a finite time ago to create the beginning of physical time, wouldn't that entail an actual infinity, which Craig uses philosophical arguments to say can't possibly exist? Well, if we look at Craig's attempted solution to this challenge of an omniscient God knowing an actual infinity of things, he tries to say that God's omniscience entails that he knows all true things non-propositionally, as if by instinct. That seems to be a very strange way to cash out omniscience, and it has striking similarities to what the B theory says about the nature of time, but that's not Craig's biggest problem. The issue is that if God's knowledge is like this, then it is not a mental sequence of events, which is necessary to establish metaphysical time. What's most surprising about this problem is that this is the exact kind of problem that Craig brings up against any kind of a quantum cosmology giving rise to the classical picture of space-time. He insists that if such a quantum cosmology exists before the first Planck second, then it would have to have produced a universe far sooner than 13.7 billion years ago. Except the same logic he uses to say that, he has the same problem with a God eternally willing to create the universe. Quite simply, Craig can't have it both ways. Much like his stance on science and time, he needs a double standard in order for his arguments to work. I want to end with a word on approaches to the problem of time. Now, the final point that Craig made that I want to respond to is the idea that I have adopted an anti-metaphysical bias, and that I've adopted epistemological naturalism, which is equivalent to assuming metaphysical naturalism. First and foremost, I am not saying we cannot do metaphysics. Much of my arguments are metaphysical in nature. What I argue against is the sort of ill-defined analytic metaphysics that Craig wants to engage in. What I do say is that if we are going to do metaphysics, then that metaphysics should be heavily informed by science. Notice I did not say that we should just start from science and blindly accept all of its metaphysical assumptions. And this is not what epistemological naturalism says either. Ironically, on epistemological naturalism, science and metaphysics feed into each other in sort of a feedback loop. Further, epistemological naturalism is not at all simply assuming metaphysical naturalism. To assert the two are equivalent is to completely undermine the approach of natural theology that Craig favors. It would mean that by using science to investigate the natural world, we would never be able to conclude that there is a God. This is why I've allocated the bulk of my arguments here to looking at the metaphysical assumptions of both Craig's Neo-Lorentzian view and the standard interpretation of relativity. The goal is to show exactly why science goes with one over the other for over a century and why we should too. This does not entail that we foolishly accept science as the only path to knowledge. All my argument requires is that we accept that science is a valid path to knowledge, which Craig Craig clearly has to do in order to appeal to the scientific evidence to try and support his premise. I don't think that science is the only path to knowledge, but I do think that Craig's preferred style of analytic metaphysics is extremely problematic. For more on this, I recommend a great article by Massimo Pigliucci on the kinds of problems entailed with Craig's approach to metaphysics, which can be found at Scientia Salon, which I'm linking in the description box. However, even if I accepted Craig's preferred style of analytic metaphysics as a valid path to knowledge, and I don't, he's still got a problem. If I have two paths to knowledge, and they end up giving me contradictory answers, which one do I go with? Contrary to what Craig says, we most certainly can make an inductive case based on past evidence to prefer the approach of science versus his analytic metaphysics. The methods of science have a clearly superior track record in terms of revealing consistent truths about reality compared to what Craig's style of analytic metaphysics has delivered throughout the centuries. In the end, it's all about what presuppositions you bring into evaluating the evidence. I'm advocating bringing in the least amount of assumptions possible, and even examining those assumptions based on new empirical evidence. This is what science and philosophy science actually does. Contrast what I've outlined here with what Craig says about science and the nature of time in his response to me. Craig insists that science, i.e. the standard interpretation, simply assumes that there is no privileged reference frame, whereas his theory just assumes there is one. This implies that the two theories are on a par with each other, but that would be false. In light of the inconclusive nature of the metaphysical arguments on time, we could try to take the agnostic metaphysical position and avoid making sweeping assumptions about minor issues like the fundamental nature of space and time. Now, after taking that seemingly sensible position, we could simply investigate reality to check for the existence of a privileged frame. However, when we do that, we not only find zero evidence for the privileged frame, but good evidence that the laws of nature are Lorentz invariant, which strongly counts against the existence of such a frame. Remember the analogy to the dragon in my garage. Sure, Craig can maintain compatibility with the uncomfortable reality that his beliefs find themselves in, but he has to deny that nature is truly as we observe it in order to avoid problems for his theory. That's the difference between our positions on this issue. I can at least start from the agnostic position and work my way towards justifying belief that there is no privileged reference frame on the basis of observation, a set of neutral justifications based on the philosophy of science, and metaphysical arguments. In comparison, Craig must rely solely on metaphysical arguments to justify assuming that a privileged reference frame must exist. What's worse is that he uses this assumption to justify reinterpreting any scientific evidence or models we have in light of his first philosophy, which we see in his treatment of various eternal cosmological models that he discusses on his website. In this way, Dr. Craig shows himself to be little better in his treatment of science than young Earth creationists like Ken Ham. I really hate having such a long video, but the amount of effort required to dispel bullshit is an order of magnitude greater than it takes to say it. I've been crafting this response since William Lane Craig's podcast in March, and I've had a lot of help along the way, and I want to give some shout-outs for it. First and foremost would be Dan Finke, who is my philosophy professor in his online classes for a semester, which I highly recommend. Next up would be Dan Linford, whose blog I am linking in the description box. Next would be Skepticism First on Twitter. Next up is Jonathan Pierce, the Tippling Philosopher. Next is Justin Schieber and Jeremy Behan of Reasonable Doubts. And finally, if you've made it this far, I want to thank you for watching.